This is Marianne Mohenraj for the Speculative Literature Foundation. I'm here at ICFA in March 2025 interviewing Andy Duncan. I've known Andy for quite a while at this point, a few decades, I think, and he is an award-winning writer. A few things that he's known for, his story, and I may pronounce some of these wrong, Andy, please feel free to correct me. My story, The Potawatomi Giant, his story,
right. Yep.
And his collection, Beluthahachie, and Other Stories. Both of those won the World Fantasy Award in 2001. His novella, The Chief Designer, won the Ted Sturgeon Memorial Award in 2002. He has been nominated 5 times for the Nebula Awards, 3 times for the World Fantasy Award, twice for the Hugo Award. He has a few collections out, of which the most recent one is Agent of Utopia, which came out from Small Bear Press. And we're going to talk today about that collection and specifically the first story in it, and also his one of his short stories published in Asimov's Charlie Tells Another One. So, and generally, I wanted to talk to him about voice, and I think maybe is there anything else you want to add to your intro that you particularly want to highlight, or?
I've done a lot of nonfiction originally in newspapers and magazines, and lately I've been trying to do more creative nonfiction.
Oh, nice.
And do like regional stuff around my area and find out about all the local legends and so on and so forth, which is very interesting.
Excellent. Yeah. So I think your work. So I've heard Andy read many times at conventions, and he's a great reader, a great storyteller, and we're hoping to make sure that there's a recording of him reading one of his stories that will be appended to this. I think you are known as a Southern writer, and known for a kind of folkloric voice. In Charlie Tells Another One, I started reading it, and I was like, initially you're with the Mill Kids, and it's clearly a story about labor and the sort of the abuses of capitalism, etc. But then there comes a point where he hears a banjo player, and it morphs into what I was taking as a version of The Devil Went Down to Georgia, which I don't know if that was what you intended. So maybe if you could talk just a little bit about what you were thinking about going into that story, what research you did, if you did research, that kind of thing.
That's part of this longer sequence that I've been working on for years, because there was a pioneering old-time musician and singer from Piedmont, North Carolina, Charlie Poole. There is still, I believe, a Charlie Poole Memorial Festival in that area of North Carolina, and he is well known among connoisseurs of like old-time music. Like one of his early recordings shows up on Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music, because he really came along before there was anything we now think of, not only as a country music industry, but as a pop music industry.
Right.
It was just the early days of phonograph recordings or wax cylinder recordings, when there were trucks going around with portable equipment, semi-portable, at least you could load it on a truck with much effort and unload it. And this was the era when these landmark people like Jimmie Rodgers and the Carter family, famously on the same weekend, came down the hill from opposite directions and recorded for Ralph Peer in Bristol, Virginia. But Charlie was one of these pioneering people. There was no Music Row in Nashville to contribute songs, So he was singing everything he could find, everything he had learned growing up, from vaudeville numbers to like old time folk ballads and things like that. But he had also just was a largely self-taught or communally taught banjo player and singer and so forth. And to modern ears, it sounds pretty unsophisticated, pretty raw, like the blues singers of the era. And yet there's a lot of history coming out of those sounds. So I'm just fascinated by him and his short life and how much he crammed into that short life.
I'll interrupt you for 1 sec, just
Yes.
on the raw piece of it. I just think it's interesting. So I love folk music. I love singer-songwriters, and that's a lot of what I listen to. And my daughter and I have had these discussions where she's 17, she's trying to share her music with me. I'm trying to share my music with her, and she likes Taylor Swift. She likes, she likes all of these poppy people, and I listen to them. I'm like, they seem like they're so produced to me, to my ear, but her take on my stuff is, it just sounds like it's somebody with a guitar, and I'm like, yes, that's what it is.
That's the goal. Yes.
Yeah. So,
That form of music, and I love Taylor Swift too. I have her Time magazine cover up on my office door.
Yeah,
it's
she's great.
It's a conversation starter, but yes, a completely different approach to everything.
Yeah. And she's not as heavily produced as some of the ones. So anyway,
but I'm just fascinated by Poole. So there hasn't been a lot written about him in terms of biography. There's a bit more written about him in terms of discography and musicology, or for particular songs or recordings. But I have copious files in the cloud and bookshelves devoted to various items about Poole and his era, and I have a lot of material written which is groping its way toward becoming a novel. And Charlie Tells Another One is by far the biggest chunk that has actually seen print, because I started looking at the mass and wondering if there were discrete threads I could pull out. And for lack of a better term, as a comic book fan, I think of Charlie Tells Another One as like his origin story in a way, of how he met Dana and how he took up the banjo seriously. But I think you're absolutely right to say it can be read as a deal with the devil story.
Well, I mean, that's one of the stories he tells about how he heard his
story he tells.
right?
That's right,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
So the implication is that he tells all these completely different stories, and the odds are that almost all of them, if not all, are completely made up. And yet the larger story, Charlie Tells Another One, does have that similar structure of how he originally got this scar that helped his playing, so he always argued. Whereas I'm sure like Jerry Garcia with his missing fingers, he was just accommodating. He was or Paul McCartney with his left hand. He just had to restring everything and get more creative,
I don't know. I kind of like that. I'm not sure which of his stories he tells is my favorite, but the bit where he has to pleasure the devil and she breaks his fingers in the process.
That's right.
I was like, that's pretty good.
I like that one too. I mean, if your fingers must get broken, that's the way to go. That's the way to do it.
You do have there is an implication of a magical element that in that Dana has this. Like a sixth sense, right?
Yes.
That he knows when something's going to happen, and he feels twitchy, like ants under his skin, and then he writes a song about it.
And that's my attempt to sort of. Le Guin talks about the literalized metaphor, and I don't know that as one of the big engines of spec fic, and I don't know that this quite fits that, but it's something adjacent. Because the musicologists talk a lot about the sometimes almost uncanny dissemination of a song, of a lyric, and how come all of a sudden people were singing about Casey Jones or whatever, and so I got to thinking if there's some sort of something that certain individuals, musical individuals, are tapping into or becoming aware of simultaneously. You know, that I'm playing with all that throughout the mass of the material.
Like the Jungian unconscious.
It very much is,
Yeah.
And as an undergrad psychology student, I did not major in it, but I had required classes in it. And I thought, well, you know, Freud is sort of handy, but Jung is onto something. You know, Freud has problems, but I think Jung is onto something. And just the more I read about Uncle Carl, the more it seemed like he was probably the one to hang with, you know, or talk to. But so I do. And so that's some of what I'm playing with there. But I have been in part because of where I grew up. I've just been fascinated by the legends, plural, of the devil or Satan or Beelzebub or the enemy or the evil one, or however you want to. And I cannot remember a time. I used to be a lot more religious than I am now. I have drifted away from the organized religion of my youth. But I cannot remember a time when I actually believed in the devil as anything other than, as a colleague of mine puts it at my university, a centuries-old fanfic that John Milton and countless other people have contributed to, and also any number of regional cultural storytellers. You know, there are elements in the devil stories of the trickster stories from Africa and the jinn stories from Arabia and the Middle East, and so on and so on and so forth. All those ancestral monsters of and not even monsters, but just spirits of the Caribbean or Japan or what have you. There's figures like that all over, and somehow in the Western world, and in particular the United States, we wind up with this, you know, pointy-eared, horned, trident-carrying, red-skinned figure who is also often embodied as, you know, sharpies, con artists, tricksters in blue serge suits or whatever, pinstripes. And of course that's so ingrained in so much music, not only music about the devil, but also origin stories about the music. Famously, the Tommy Johnson / Robert Johnson stories about the selling your soul at the crossroads to gain power over your instrument. You know,
I mean, it's sort of fascinating. I mean, here we are at a science fiction convention, hanging out with writers, and, you know, thinking about, like, what would you do for fame? Like, what would you do? What would you do to be the best?
Yes.
Right? Like,
what would you do? And this is and the Faust myth is so potent, and we are still dealing with it. I mean, that's material as diverse as Oliver Stone's Wall Street, which and the recent Donald Trump movie, The Apprentice, and also the recent Netflix Follow the House of Usher, where all these kids are cursed in part because of the deal, the tacit deal that Roderick and Madeline made, you know, as young people, you know.
Because as a young person, you know, I think about this as a parent, like, you know, I have two kids, 17 and 15, and they are very smart, but they have no perspective yet, right? Like, they haven't lived long enough to have much perspective. They're, you know, heading towards adulthood, and so consequences are very theoretical to them, right? And so you know, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because your character, Charlie, right? We first meet him as a mill kid, and it's very grounded in sort of the politics of the people at the time who are sort of trained to be grateful for their quote unquote good jobs, because at least they're not picking cotton in the fields with the slaves, and and yet, you have this beautiful passage. I really love the scene when you're describing the work in the mill and that how they, there's, by the end of the day, there's just this clouds of the material floating around, and they have to like peel the mask of it off of them, and then of course that gets fed back into the mill to then choke them again the next day, right, and destroy their lungs and so on, right? And it actually reminded me, now I'm going to forget the name of it. There's a story I teach, something of maidens, the Paradise of Bachelors and the
Tartarus of Maids.
The Tartarus of Maids,
yes,
that's the one. And I was wondering whether you had that sort of in the back of your head when you're doing this.
Probably, but not consciously. I had not thought of it in that context.
Because in that story, when we get the description of the mills, it's like the mill is sucking all the life out of these paper white girls who live in the mills, and it's like, a bloody monster that's consuming them, right? And so it just seemed very, very in keeping with what you were doing here.
I know I was consciously thinking too of, and I've forgotten the author's name, her name, but it was whoever wrote Life in the Iron Mills from the 19th century.
I haven't read that one.
Which was in one of my graduate school 19th century
Rebecca Harding Davis?
Yes, that's
Rebecca Harding Davis. Okay, I haven't read that one. And the Tartarus of Maids is Herman Melville, of course. So,
But anyway, those were, I'm writing down the Tartarus of Maids. I brought I love office supplies, and so I got a new notebook just to write down all the recommended titles. But I read that years ago. John Kessel, I'm John Kessel's boy. He got me to reading a lot of Melville, as he does everybody.
They have it in the Vandermeer's Big Book of Classic Fantasy.
That's right, it is. Yeah. I love that book.
Yeah.
My favorite of their huge anthologies is The Weird, but I love that one too.
We've gone far afield.
We've gone far afield, but that's all right.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm glad that passage struck you so, and was so vivid to you, because I wanted to make clear what Charlie was trying to get away from. I think we're much more aware as a culture and through pop culture of what, say, the coal miners went through than we are, because there were occasional coal mine disasters, and still are, somewhere in the world. But not so much the textile mill difficulties and trials, and yes, the lung ailments and the difficulty breathing that you eventually had after a lifetime of this was just laid people out the way Black Lung did, the miners.
Well, and you talk about how the machines have to keep running, because if you stop them when a bobbin is full, that costs money, and at least these people are being told that we're on tight margins,
That's right.
And so we have to
Exactly.
keep it running, and so we need small children whose fingers will fit between the gears to pull the bobbin, and I'm like, oh my god, and some of them are losing fingers as a result, right? So I think that theme gets carried through, right? Earlier it's the mill that causes people to lose fingers, and then eventually Charlie supposedly deliberately gives up his fingers, right? So
that's right. Yep.
See, look at me, I'm an English teacher. I can carry it through.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, that's great. You go. People come up to me and they say, "Here's what I see in your story." I always say, "Sure. There it is. There it is."
I intended that. Well, probably the back of your brain did. Right?
On some level.
Yeah.
I believe that you don't have to be a Jungian, but to believe that everything you experience is still within you somehow and gets processed in ways you don't understand. We people who do writing or any creative work know that to be true, because we think, where did that come from? And then we eventually remember where it came from or realize. But that's what all the Charlie Poole mass is about. And this particular story that I took to the Sycamore Hill workshop, and they encouraged me to tidy it up and send it to Asimov's. Is the biggest chunk of it so far to appear in print, and I'm pretty sure.
But novels in the works.
And I'm pretty yes, and I'm pretty sure that. I was trying to remember who suggested that title. It did not originally have that title, but I believe it may have been Siobhan Carroll and my wife Sydney simultaneously in two different places. Because originally I just had some placeholder like banjo music or something on it, and everybody agreed that was not it.
Well, so let me go back to voice for a second and just to talk about the beginning of the story, because I was really struck. Like, I struggle with differentiating voice for my characters. It's not something that comes easily to me, right? And, so so historical material is tough, right? Because I'm just, I don't know, like I feel like I'm having a hard time getting the slang, etc., so on. So for example, here in the story, there's a bit fairly early on, I'm just going to read this out, where the kids are talking, the company man is coming to the doorstep for the rent. The kids who are too young to work are handing over the coins. "I hate that old bald cooter," Hurley announced one day. "I hate him too," said Bendigo, who was always quick to repeat anything his next older brother said. Bendigo just as happily would have echoed Hurley, saying, "I love the company man and want to be his girly bride." Their mama called Bendigo Mockingbird, but he wouldn't let the others call him that. "Mockingbird," jeered Charlie, and Hurley, who always took up for his loyal yes man, promptly knocked Charlie down. So I read that and I was like, that's great. It's so, like, in the moment with these kids. And I'm curious, like, did you just know what the language that they would have used is from reading? Did you research things specifically to get that kind of thing?
No, I didn't, because until relatively recently, there are no history books about, like, the everyday lives of working people, much less their kids.
Right.
And obviously kids don't leave documents that are retained by history. Traditionally, they don't wind up in archives and so forth. But I have a pretty good memory for the sort of things I used to say as a kid, or the things kids say all around me now. I don't have any kids of my own, but there are a lot of neighbor kids and kids at the stores.
Yeah, it
and
really got their dynamic down, right?
And you're always trying, and you know this. All fiction writers are always trying to get across as much as they can in as short a space as possible, even if they're writing multi-novel series. You still don't want any wasted space in there. And so I thought the best way to show these three kids and their relationship was just to have this sort of it's almost leaping from point of view character to point of view character, and that one very short, or it's sort of an omniscient take. But anybody that watches siblings at work or interacting with each other gets a very quick sense of what the relationship is, whether they're 8, 9, and 7, or whether they're 30 and 32.
Yeah, I really like the fact that we give, like, in some sense, there's nothing super plot relevant in that little exchange, right? The fact that that Hurley might not be straight is not relevant to anything else in the story, right? And the interaction between the kids is only relevant insofar as that Charlie kind of concocts this plot to murder the company man. And gets the others to go along with him on this. So there's a certain amount of, like, community building that happens as part of that interchange, and like understanding that, like, they're going to be in conflict, but you can still get together to take down the man, which is kind of hilarious.
Right. And Charlie is already the planner, the mover, and the renegade, the rebel.
Yeah, right. So you establish all of that in a very, very small space. I thought that was really effective.
And we were talking about voice downstairs earlier in the day, because though we were no longer on a panel, it was like a panel erupted sitting out by the pool at this conference. And John Kessel was talking about how frustrated he was in his early fiction classes, the emphasis on voice and on style. And he argued that he believed then and now that there are other priorities when you're learning fiction writing, and that fiction and that it's hard to start out with voice and style as opposed to, say, plot and character and structure and so forth.
I think I might disagree.
And that's he kept apologizing to me and looking at me because he knows how important voice is for me. But when we all talk from our perspective as writers, we're all basically talking about ourselves. And here's where I come from and what my methodology is.
Has that shifted for you? I'm thinking about this, like, when I first started writing, I played around with voice a lot. And so, like, my early stories had very little plot, but just lots of different characters and voices and so on. And then as I progressed, or as I kept writing, well, let's not even call it a progression because I'm not sure it is, but as I kept writing and I got a better handle on plotting and how to tell an engaging story and so on, I ran into this question of, I don't know if you've heard this metaphor, right, that like some fiction is like a stained glass window and some is like a clear window. And I kind of like started evolving more towards the clear window, and I'm still not sure whether that was just easier, right? As when I was trying to learn everything else, to also maintain a strong set of voices or something was maybe like a lot for me. I don't know, but I'm missing it now, and it's something that, like, right now, 30 years into my career, I'm trying to go back into story, like a novel that I'm working on, and like see, can I bring out voice more? Like, the rest of it's pretty good at this point. I'm happy with it, but I don't know. So that's very rambly. Any thoughts you have?
I think for me, growing up, a constant reader, an extremely text-heavy life.
Yeah.
But I was also simultaneous. I was at the library all the time, and my mother read novels serially. She would never close one novel having finished it without picking up the next one and opening it for a chapter or two. While my father simultaneously was always poring over his reference books and his encyclopedias and his dictionaries to educate himself, having no formal education himself. And yet simultaneously, it was an oral upbringing. It was an oral tradition. And when the family would get together, stories would get told, some of which were true and some were not, some of which were about the long gone relatives, and some of which were about things that happened that day. Let me tell you what this one did, pointing at one of the kids. And so I realized that if you wanted to hold the floor and you wanted to get a word in edgeways,
you better be a good storyteller.
You better be a good storyteller yourself. So I began practicing that at school and everywhere I went and so forth. And I got known for that, without the slightest notion that this would ever be professionally useful.
Well, and it's interesting, like your journalism career, presumably you had to kind of set much of that aside, right?
Yes, except I had the great good fortune right out of school, and I got a journalism degree and as many English classes as I could, just because I got A's in the English classes.
It's a good reason.
But, yeah, it's a good reason. But I had the great good fortune that I got hired on by the newspaper in Greensboro, North Carolina, which at the time had a big circulation. It was then the third largest circulation paper in North Carolina, behind the Charlotte Observer and the Raleigh News and Observer. So we had like 120,000 copies every day, and in that pre-digital age, it was fat with advertising, and the money was rolling in, and you had dozens and dozens of people on staff, and people could specialize, which is almost gone. You know, even the New York Times is not as does not have that a lot of personnel to rely on. But as a result, because I was a good writer and because that was where their needs were, I got hired right out of school as a full-time features writer. So I was not having to cover courts and city hall and the police beat. I was.
You were telling stories.
I was much more freer to find different ways to tell stories, and much of the meat and potatoes of my job, pardon to the vegans, but the basic part of my job was finding interesting people to write about and spending time with them and writing down as best I could how exactly they talked. And I was at the same time reading collected works of journalists like Joan Didion and Joseph Mitchell and John McPhee and the New York columnists and the Chicago columnists, Edna Buchanan, the police reporter, who were like great reporters, but they were also storytellers. And they would and Joseph Mitchell really impressed me because he would just quote like a street preacher for like 3 pages solid. In the book is like this one long paragraph monologue. And I asked one of my mentors at the newspaper one day, I said, because he was a Mitchell fan, and I said, how in the world in the 1930s was he able to get all this down? And
because he wouldn't have had a recording
He couldn't have had a
device.
portable device to record it on and so forth. And Jim Schlosser said, well, he just made it up. And I must have looked so stricken that he quickly rushed in to try to salvage something. And he said, I don't mean that, but I mean that he had to spend a lot of time with this guy, write down as much as he could of like 5 different monologues. And then for effect, when he put the story together, he puts them all together as if it's one continuous one-day thing. And that made complete sense with me. But in so doing, I got to talk with Ariel Dorfman, the Chilean dissident, and spend time with him and with old ladies who were the first elected black judge in North Carolina, with fiddlers in the mountains, old mountain guys, with young women who were teaching in one-room schoolhouses on Ocracoke, and so on and so forth, and just writing down and then when I picked up fiction a few years later, I said, wow, why am I so good at characters and dialogue? And I thought, well, you fool, that's just what you've been writing. That's what you've been writing for years. You know, you've been getting in people's heads. So I think that was. I think if I had spent the equivalent 7 years just on the cop beat or whatever, I would have learned one set of skills, but it would not have served me as well in fiction, I don't think.
Fascinating. I'm curious, like, okay, actually, let me pull 2 things out of here. One, I just want to sort of emphasize, you know, that idea of he patched together these different monologues to make something. I think sometimes younger writers can kind of get hung up on like, well, it's not true, it's not accurate. And I from my creative nonfiction class in grad school, I remember we spent a long time on this, and kind of what you're aiming for is not necessarily absolute word by word fact, but you are aiming to represent truth, right? And that's, you know,
you were aiming not to misrepresent the subject or give a false version of it.
I admit I get kind of annoyed when journalists misquote me, but it just happened a couple times. But for the kind of piece you're talking about, I think you want someone to read it if the person you wrote about reads it, you want them to say, yeah, that's basically right, you know.
I was very proud of the fact that in all those years, nobody ever called in to say I misquoted them or anything, or that they didn't recognize themselves. But Tina Connolly and Carolyn Yoakum team taught Clarion West during pandemic, I think, and they taught one of the later weeks, and I taught week one, and some of our communal students are here this weekend, so we've been talking. But Carolyn said they made a great team to teach with, because to teach the students, to show two completely different approaches. Because Carolyn always begins, she said, where you have the idea, and then you build out the idea, and everything else comes from that. Whereas Tina has to start with the character, and if she doesn't know the character, then nothing else can get built out. And I said, well, if I had been the third leg of the tripod that week, I would have said I have to know the voice that the story's going to be told in, or nothing else fits into place.
So
but that just shows there are very different approaches for different writers, all of which could be valid depending on where you are in your project, what you're working on, you know, what your priority is that year, or whatever. For me, I realized early on in the fiction career that if I knew what the voice was, it was so much easier.
Yeah, it's funny. I heard Ted Chiang talking at one point about his stories, which are so idea based, and he says he has the idea first, he works it all out, he works out the plot, and then he like comes up with the characters. And I'm so, not only could I not do that, I also I'm really impressed with how well he does it, because something like Stories of Your Life,
I was just thinking,
I mean, that is all about character.
All character. It seems to be character foregrounded. But Ted thinks about everything.
Yeah. And he did interview women and mothers for that piece, right? To he doesn't just casually build the character.
He's very methodical.
Yeah. So.
And by the time he's done, and he thinks about a character who would exemplify the very phenomenon he's writing about, or that he wants to examine. And by the time he's done, it's so seamless that it is nothing like an appendage or an afterthought. And Ted is just brilliant. I'm friends with so many brilliant people, but the only two that I habitually toss around the G word, genius, about, much though it annoys them both, are Ted and Kelly Link. Because they both are so uniquely themselves. You know.
I'm reading her novel right now.
Yes,
it's blown me away. So, I think I would start, when I write stories, I have usually a little idea that sparks it, and then I go from there quickly to character and spend a while with character, and it's once dialogue starts to show up in my head is when I start writing the story down. I can't really do it till I get to that point.
The characters start talking to each other, and you say, "Oh, great! Now I can take dictation."
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
So.
I mean, none of it comes easily, but everybody has things that come more easily to them than others.
So, if you were gonna advise students, like young writers, new writers, try not to say young, because people can come to writing at any age. So newer writers who want to develop a stronger voice, maybe a stronger, and maybe they're particularly interested in a cultural, regional, etc. kind of thing. What advice would you give?
Well, there are, even if you're not in the unique position that I was in, of having some sort of day job that required you to go out and talk to people, you can think of other ways to go out and talk to people and meet people and converse with people. You can volunteer, you can get politically active, you can even I don't know, hang out in bars, restaurants, all sorts of immersive experiences you can do.
I heard that the advice someone suggested was to ride the subway and
That's a very good.
Just literally just write down.
That's
what
a very good
saying.
suggestion. One of my assignments I give to my journalism students, my fiction students, is eavesdropping on conversations, like at lunchtime in the cafeteria or whatever.
I'm reminded of in Ben Franklin's autobiography. He talks about when he was young, like a teenager, he wanted to be a great statesman, and so he went and got speeches by great statesmen, and then he sat and copied them out.
Yes.
And to like get the rhythms into his head. I thought that was fascinating. Like, what teenager does that? I don't even know. But
right. Yeah. The Ben Franklins do that. But I have done that very similar thing, and I know people who have, they want to try a hard-boiled detective novel of some kind. And so they'll take Raymond Chandler chapter or a Sarah Paretsky chapter or whatever, and they'll or Walter Mosley, very different thing but similar base, and they'll just type out, like a chapter of it, just to feel what those sentences feel like and those paragraphs feel like coming through their fingers. And I believe that has a help. That is a help. That has some osmosis to it. But I think widening their acquaintance as much as possible. But they can also practice. There are now in the digital age so many archival recordings and videos and transcripts and things of people from all over all walks of life talking. I mean, it's still skewed toward the movers and shakers and the white people.
Although you'd be surprised. Like, I was working on my my vegan cookbook, the Sri Lankan cookbook. And I was trying to look up some recipes for milk rice, which is like a coconut milk rice, which is a very significant dish in Sri Lankan culture. And I was on YouTube, and there was someone, it was the channel is something about village life, and it was a young woman with her grandmother, and where she's been recording, like, this is my mom cooking in, like, a very humble village in Sri Lanka, and talking a little bit. Mostly she's just like cooking, but it gives you a sense of like, oh, this is like how they did it for the last 1,000 years, right? Like, this is like, and that's available now in a way that it would not. I would have had to go there. Now I can like listen to her talk and watch her cook and see how she holds the knife between her toes and like and then cuts it on there. I mean, I would never have come up with that detail.
Sure. Oral histories fascinate me. Even oral histories of like how a movie got made or something like that. But one of the things I just bid on in the auction room was like an assembled like oral history of the pulp days, from all the writers and editors. But but all those things help a lot, and you can practice this anywhere, wherever you go. You can practice just capturing people's voices. And think about the performers that really interest you, whether that's actors or musical artists, songwriters, whatever. They all have ways of expressing themselves. A Beyonce song is not like a Tom Waits song. Is not like an Aunt Molly Jackson song. So. I
mean, I'm unlikely to write stories set in the South or Nashville. I haven't spent that much time there, but I do love the music, right?
Yes.
And like, I went to RWA had a retreat in Nashville, and for my 50th birthday, I gave myself a present of going to that because first of all, I watched the show Nashville, which is a guilty pleasure, and I went to they have this place, the Bluebird Cafe, in the show.
Yes.
And I couldn't get tickets for that, but there was a similar place, the Listening Room, which I could go to, and I had lunch there, and you can sit like right up next to the stage, have your lunch, and these singer-songwriters come out and they play you something they're working on and they talk about their process. It was just an incredible experience. I think that's what I would do. Or I did my undergrad at the University of Chicago, and they had this big folk music festival that they hosted, and you could just spend 3 days like listening to these people talk and sing. It was tremendous.
It's pretty good advice for everybody in all walks of life to listen more.
Yeah.
But for writers particularly, I think they really have to come to trust that ear, and because once you've got all this babble of voices in your head, it's like having a broader vocabulary to choose from.
Have you ever had anyone tell you, like, you got it wrong? Like, this doesn't sound authentic to me?
That's a very good question. I don't think anybody has said so in so many words, but it does come up in critique. It comes up in workshop situations. Like, this part sounds a little off. It's usually presented as, this seems out of character. Like this word right here. I think they'd use some different word and so forth.
I've had so I read stories about Sri Lankans set in the future, right, on other planets, and I had one critique from a Sri Lankan friend of mine who likes my writing generally, but he was like, these people are too polite to each other. They don't they're just something about the character interactions read very Western to him, rather than rather than how people actually are with each other in Sri Lanka. And I was like, okay, but this is the future, and it's diaspora times 10, so they could evolve in many different ways. But I see his point. Like, it was not ringing true to him, so it was interesting.
My gosh, I'm sure on every page we get 100 things wrong.
Well, yeah.
but and usually people in person at least are too kind to point out all that. But I think in many cases we are harder on ourselves than the readers tend to be. I think we certainly should be harder on ourselves than we used to be about representation and appropriation and all that. But I also think we underestimate the willingness of the reader to follow along with us. We underestimate our ability within the opening pages of showing the reader how the thing should be read, which my mother instinctively did. It didn't matter the style of the novel she was reading; she could just pick that up, because she had read so much.
And we talk about the fictive dream, right? Like this, as long as you can create something kind of consistent, right, that the reader can fall into, and it may not be completely accurate, but if it's consistent and you've created a world for them and a voice, they'll stay with it, right?
Yeah. We also have to be careful in our attempt to get the character just right, make the character too homogeneous and too predictable and because then we're risking becoming a stereotype. And of course, each of us is a mass of contradictions. So just the fact that this is a very somebody that's never left the province, or the neighborhood, doesn't mean they could not be a very forward-thinking person based on whatever experience or whatever stray occurrence in their lives, or just the way those 3 kids in the story that we started out with are already differentiated in personality, just for ineffable reasons, even though they are genetically the same.
So I think you're mostly, or maybe not mostly, but a lot of your reputation has been around your work in the South and with folktales and kind of folkloric, supernatural, ghost story kind of vibe. so I was surprised when I started reading Agent of Utopia. I was going to
yes.
transition to that because I was like, this is not an Andy Duncan story.
That's right. That's right.
But
You're right.
it is because you wrote it. And so this is a historical story set around the execution of Sir Thomas More, and I think if you have not read, or at least read a summary of More's Utopia, it may take a little while to figure out what's going on. But you don't actually need to have read it to enjoy this story. And so
no, it's not. No, and More's Utopia is so much longer than my story.
Yes. So don't go read More's Utopia.
There
first.
are plenty of reasons to read More's Utopia, but I don't think my story is one of them.
But so, what led you to write the story? So, in the story, you have you have someone from Utopia who comes to offer to rescue Sir Thomas More from his execution
on a mission sent by the conceit being that the utopia that More wrote about is not just a literary construct, but an actual place. And an emissary, basically a secret agent from Utopia, shows up to help More, and More does not want the help. But once the agent is in London, the agent is on their own to figure things out. I'm fascinated with that time period. I'm fascinated with the Renaissance and Shakespeare's era, Tudor era, the whole Wolf Hall thing. I'm not alone in my fascination, of course. But if anything, that's probably one of the most plundered periods of history for fiction. But that actually began when I was in grad school, and then as now, professors cleaning out their offices with just stacked free books in boxes outside, as you and your colleagues do, I'm sure, as I have done. And I just looked down, and it was the very paperback edition of Utopia that I see in the auction room today. More's Utopia and Its Critics, one of the teaching anthologies. It's still a slim book. There's like 5 or 6 essays about it. And I just picked it up and stuck it in my backpack as I was walking past, because I thought, well, here's a a proto-science fiction story that I've never read, but I've always heard about it, and I should read it one day. And it took me years to actually read it, and still I would have to reread it for a lot of the details. It's not exactly a driving narrative. It's not.
It's like a thought experiment.
It's a thought experiment. It's a series of dialogues. It's a philosophical work as much as anything. But I did distinctly remember that as I walked home, I was thinking about what little I knew about More and Utopia. And when I got home, the first thing I did when I sat down the backpack was reach for a notebook, and I wrote down An Agent of Utopia and put quote marks around it, just because I thought that would be a good title, and because to me it sounded incredibly ominous. Because, Stalin thought he was building a utopia. Trump thinks he's building a utopia, and so forth. But it was many years before I figured out what the story would be to accompany that title. But that was the origin.
That's the origin. I was reading through it. It made me think of, I teach intro to fantasy and science fiction course, and I often open with a story from the Vandermeer's Big Book of Science Fiction, Sultana's Dream, which is another, here's a woman imagining, a world in which, and that story. Sorry, let me look for a second. So, this was a Bengali writer, and she wrote this story in, when was it? 1905, right? And and she imagines a world where the men are locked up in the harem, and the women have built this society which has things like solar power, right? I mean, it's and so what I remember of More's Utopia is on the gender front is that it's not great
Yes.
by our standards, but possibly was a slight improvement from
Right.
his time period. And also, if I'm remembering right, there are a bunch of contradictions in it. Like, you know,
Yes.
he's a Catholic, but in his utopia, divorce is okay,
That's
and
right,
there's
yes.
various things like that.
Which helps lead to all the fascinating commentary, some of which is in that volume, about to what extent did Moore have his tongue in his cheek? To what extent did he hate the utopia he was building? To what extent was he sincere? You know, it's a very long game Moore is playing, and we're still debating, you know, what it meant. Moore himself, I am not a big fan of, from what I know in history.
I mean, as Lord Chancellor, he was brutal, right?
He was brutal, persecuting the those he saw as blasphemers or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And so my Moore in the story, his cameo turns out to.
I don't want to give it away.
I don't want to give things away, but it
so.
emphasizes the religious zealot in him. Yeah. Which is one reason he frustrates the title character, the agent, when the agent shows up. But because Moore is so not with the program.
Right.
But and eventually Moore's daughter sort of takes over. You know, the story, that's the Chief Moore.
Right. It's fascinating because you've got, you know, utopia is, you know, sort of like portrayed as this very rational kind of place, right? And you know, this kind of like, oh, we'll just divide everything evenly, and we'll wear sensible clothing, and you know, no one will have to work more than 6 hours a day, and we'll have slaves, but of course, because
even the slaves will be better off.
They will be better
than they would as free citizens back home.
And you can earn your way out.
Yeah, and you can earn your way out. So it's sort of a benign indentured servitude.
Fascinating, and I think and so you've got that whole rational attempt at creating this utopia, and then you contrast that with this mystical almost figure of Moore, right? And and then in the story, I'm trying really hard not to give things away. You all should just read it, but like there is a supernatural element that appears partway through that is. I don't know, that like shocks everybody, you know.
Which could be read as just a manifestation of whatever is going on with the agent, but also could be read as just what it is, and I have issues with big cities, and this agent has issues with London, Tudor London. And the crowds and the noise and what the agent perceives as filth, and so on and so forth, and when I read from it here years ago as it was being published, a very Catholic friend of mine who is still a regular at the conference eased up to me in the crowd after the reading, and he murmured at me. He said, "You realize that he loves my work and loved that story." But he just murmured at me. He said, "You realize that we Catholics consider Moore a saint?" I said, "Yes." I smiled at him, and he nodded and smiled and walked away. You know, he just wanted to remind me. You know,
it can be a little tricky working with that.
It's tough. That's right. It's tough. So it wouldn't be for everybody. But I love that these are the two that you just recently read or reread to talk about today. Because it does not immediately seem there's a lot in common, except they're both historical pieces.
They're both historical. They both have very strong voices.
They're both very voice pieces. They're both from basic and Agent is much closer to the title character's persona than the narrator of the Charlie Poole story is, even though that is pretty close to just following Charlie throughout. but it does do these oracular summary things of like who Daner Johnson was and so forth. But they are both. I worked hard on how they would sound, how the narration would sound. So if you want to call it, it's very hard to talk about voice for one reason. If you haven't read a lot, you haven't talked to a lot of different people, you haven't written much, it's very hard to explain what you mean by voice. And when the Clarion West folks put together their anthology of nonfiction writing advice from the various instructors and alumni, I asked Hugh, the editor, when he recruited me, I said, the co-editor, I asked Hugh, I said, what do you want me to write about? He said, you can write about anything you want. And I said, great. And then he immediately said, but I'd really love for you to write about voice. And I thought, damn it, that's the hardest thing to write about. But I took on the challenge, and I may send you a copy of that after this, because I realized in writing it what a difficult task Hugh had set me, because it was trying to articulate to a wide audience just what I mean when I say voice or think about voice. And it's so hard to talk about without it privileging hearing, which for the many hearing impaired writers is just like at best just going to miss the mark and not convey meaning, but and at worst is just going to be, you know, ableist and so forth. So I had to think of other examples and ways to express it.
Oh, I'd love to read that.
And what I finally came up with was something close to the words themselves and the meaning of the word in concert, or in calculated or studied adjacency to one another. So obvious examples, you know, harsh, angry world, jagged staccato, blunt consonants, you know, and things like that. Not a lot of sibilants, you know. The difference between, you know, Greek and French, you know, or the Slavic tongues and Scotland or whatever.
Have you run across Le Guin's Steering the Craft book?
Yes.
Because, you know, I find her early exercises, the first like 4 or 5 chapters are all on like sentence, paragraph level work. And like she's got the short and long exercise and like the like pull out your adjectives exercise and so on. Yes,
that's right. You're right.
And I think that has been a helpful way for me to get students to start thinking about, okay, you're writing a sex scene or a fight scene. Do you want it to be short and choppy? Do you want it to be long and flowing and complicated and piling up on each other, right? And like, what kind of mood are you going to be establishing with that style of narration? It's not quite what you're talking about, but I think it's all related.
Yes, you're right, because you have to be, it requires a level of analysis that a lot of people are just not initially doing or in the habit of doing. But once you do start thinking that way, I think new possibilities open up. And I think that's what Le Guin is trying to get at in those opening chapters.
I mean, she's trying to get you to think like a poet a little bit. Right?
Yes,
like
exactly, because I think the best prose is poetry. And I say in that essay, I came to realize eventually for my own writing that if it sounds good, it is good. And there must be something right about it, even if it's not fitting the rest of the piece. So maybe the rest of the piece has to be adjusted to make that more seamless.
Example in there from something of Mark Twain's where he's describing a river, and it's this long flowing kind of description. It's beautiful, and then there's a bit where it gets choppier and interrupted in how how the sentences are formed, right? Like more short sentences, and it's the point at which he's describing a snag in the river where some of the trees and things have like blocked the flow, and then you get clear again, and you go to this, and then it becomes flowing again until you get to this glorious sunset. It's an incredible passage, but like I don't know if I would have noticed that if Le Guin hadn't like made me look at it, right?
And in grad school, knowing already that I had done a lot of nonfiction writing and that I was now trying to dedicate myself and apply myself to being a better fiction writer, like all the fiction I read really fed this interest. And once I started thinking in these terms, I started seeing them everywhere. Like I probably read too much Faulkner in grad school because I took a Faulkner seminar.
Can you read too much Faulkner? I love it. The Sound of the Fury is one of my 10 favorite books.
Well,
so.
yes, but I was reading Absalom. I started Absalom, and the old lady is in the parlor. And it's from Quentin's point of view, but it's all her monologue about the family and the grand old days and blah, 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 all the BS that he's sort of half listening to while he's made this courtesy visit on her at tea time, or what, her Aunt Rosa Coldfield. And she goes into this like whole soliloquy that is Shakespearean in its eloquence about the family and all this. And like after 3 pages of it, I thought, absolutely no old lady in Mississippi ever talked like this, ever. And then I burst out laughing just like that because I realized that was the point. This was not Miss Rosa's speech. This was what Miss Rosa was telling Quentin, the romantic, who was like turning all of it into this like, knight errant, Mallory sort of quest story, which it never was. But so what I was getting was like Rosa in Quentin's subconscious, and I laughed out loud, and then I said, "Oh, now I know how to read this book." It was in its own way as disconcerting as the famous Benji opening chapter in Sound and the Fury, where you have to just you have to be at sea for a while before you start figuring things out.
I read something about Sound of the Fury, which so it has people listening who may not have run into this book yet. It's very confusing at first, and trying to figure out who's talking and saying what. And apparently he had originally wanted it to be color coded. The different voices were in different colors, but the printer said it was too expensive, and they didn't do it. And I keep thinking, like, I wonder, now that they're digital editions, has anyone done one that like
surely someone
that?
has. I've never looked, but that would be a great thing. That would be a lot of fun.
So I have you don't have to do this, but I'm realizing, listening to you talk, that I've read some of the things you have and not others, and I would love like a primer list, like Andy Duncan's 25 novels with great voice.
That's a wonderful question. I love making lists, and that would be useful for me too. So I may take up that challenge.
Excellent.
We'll
put it on the site if you write it. So or you can publish it somewhere, and then we'll reprint it.
we've already been talking about Faulkner. And I would certainly Zora Neale Hurston, anything fiction.
I would put in The Bone People by Carrie Holm. I don't know if you've run across that one.
I have not read that one.
Oh my gosh, Andy, this is in my 5 favorite books, I think.
Okay, The Bone People.
The Bone People by Carrie Holm, and it won the Booker Prize. It's set in New Zealand. Content note that there is some violent child abuse in the story. But it's experimental. It's very Faulknery in the complexity of its telling, and it has some very strong voice. So that's my that's the one thing I recommend for this list. But I think you could probably put quite a few titles on there.
I would put Charles Portis on there.
I don't know Charles
True
Portis.
Grit or Norwood
I've
or
heard
The Dog of the South.
But I haven't read any.
There's a new Library of America volume of all of it. And there are plenty more.
Yeah.
But like in our field, I tell you, some of the great openings I can remember, which are entirely voice. The two, as I wrote in an essay for Cascadia Subduction Zone a few years ago on Shirley Jackson, that my two favorite openings in American letters alternate between the beginning of We Always have Lived in the Castle versus the opening of The Haunting of Hill House.
Oh,
because
nice.
I think both those first passages, which are so very different, are like there's like two different voices right there. That sonorous opening of Hill House and Whatever Walked There Walked Alone. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. And you can't say that without entering this sort of trance state. Whereas the castle begins with, of course, my name is Mary Catherine Blackwood, and you get the sense of this prim adolescent like doing a recitation on stage at school, and then it becomes immediately like really odd. and remarkably the novel maintains that throughout that level. But I've often thought that with any luck at all, I could have been born a werewolf.
Nice.
But I've had to be content with what I had.
Okay, so now I want two lists. I want the
openings.
I want the openings list and the title.
The openings list and the title list.
Yeah, and because the openings I might put I love the opening to The Hobbit.
The opening of The Hobbit is great. Yes, so, you're right. And the opening to John Irving's Prayer for Owen Meany. I almost got it. I am doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice, not because of his voice, and not because he was the instrument of my mother's death, but because he is the reason I believe in God. I am a Christian because of Owen Meany.
Nice.
And I read that paragraph standing up in the library, I think. And I said, okay, this one, clearly.
Catcher in the Rye.
Catcher in the Rye, yes, I think so. Poe all over the place.
Yeah.
And so many of the writers, who wrote Luella Miller? That arguably ghost story, vampire story, weird story.
Mary E. Wilkins Freeman.
Mary Wilkins
I haven't read
Freeman.
this one. I just looked it up. But
I mean, there's so many.
Yeah.
Peter Straub did us a service in American Fantastic Tales by resurrecting, 2 volumes of these things. The first one is all through the 19th century, I think. But I mean,
definitely echo Poe. Toni Morrison has some great.
Toni Morrison, yes.
Well,
yes. And we could go on.
We could go on. We're going to write the list. Andy's going to write it and put it up.
Chandler, Patricia Highsmith, I would say. Anyway, but yes, I will come up with some lists, and then everybody can fuss
Pride
about
and Prejudice, the opening.
Yes, that's right.
So, truth universally acknowledged.
And Austen, to me, Austen sounds so modern, which is remarkable. You can read stuff written 100 years after Austen that sounds much more antiquated than that.
She does have complex sentence structures.
She does,
which some of my students struggle with. They're not used to reading that kind of thing.
That's true.
But aside from that,
but on the dialogue and on the little summaries, summary biographies of these people.
I was just rewatching Pride and Prejudice with my daughter because she's covering it in school, and I was like, I know these people today, right? Like she was so deft with the characterization. I know that mother. I know this sister, right? Like I know this father who you start off liking him. He's an indulgent dad, and he's great. And then by the end of it, you realize that he's terrible in various ways, right? And really letting the daughters down. So it's I don't know. Yeah, she knew people.
And you
really
can see
well.
why, like, Emma Thompson was so delighted to adapt Sense and Sensibility, because she just saw all these roles for herself and her friends, for Hugh Laurie. And
that's my favorite.
Hugh Grant. That's my favorite of the Austen movies. It is adaptations.
Yeah.
It's just so buoyant, and the dialogue is just, it's from Austen, and it is just great. But yes, and even that's not all I read for. I have read countless mystery novels and science fiction novels where I'm interested in the puzzle or the plot, and I'm interested in other things purely for the character, or just on the level of what's going to happen
But let me
next.
ask you this. See, this is where I sort of feel like, okay, fine, I can write a novel that has great characterization. I feel like that's one thing I'm good at. I can do plot decently, fine. But let's say I write that story and the voice is neutral, it's fine. If I could make the voice stronger, would that not make the overall thing notably better?
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
Right.
That's, I suppose, my privileging of voice. No matter what else the book is doing, no matter what else the story is doing, no matter what else the page or paragraph is doing, if it also had a voice to it, however defined or described, it would be that much better, it seems to me. And it seems to me that any of those things could be accommodated by voice or accompanied by voice, just as all those intricate ideas Ted Chiang has in Story of Your Life or in the life cycle of software objects, nevertheless comes across all the better because he's poured all that attention into the characterization and into the
Yeah, it's interesting. We were talking about utopia as a philosophical experiment, and I these days I tend to teach the ones who walk away from Omelas every semester, because my students respond to it so strongly, right?
Yes.
Like it catches them. But it's interesting because it doesn't really have characterization. It
That's
really
right.
is told as a thought experiment.
It is.
And
it is.
It has
indeed.
a voice. It has a sort of a, there's a coherent voice to it, but she doesn't dramatize it in terms of like, here's Joe. Joe has to go and visit this place where the child is being held captive, and we don't know Joe's mother. She doesn't give us, it's all told in generalities, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So it's surprisingly effective despite that. So, which I guess Le Guin is just that good. I don't know.
Yeah, Le Guin could do everything.
Yeah.
She really could, I think. We've gone more than an hour.
We've gone more than an hour.
But that's fine. We've covered some territory.
I know. So I was going to make sure that we let you go soon. So as we wrap up, is there anything about your work or what's coming up for you that you want to highlight? I mean, this is not a very, breaking news kind of interview. But
No, obviously not. I am increasingly interested in doing also creative nonfiction.
Have you talked to Alec Nevala-Lee at all?
I have, yes. I reviewed his Astounding
You reviewed
book.
Astounding, because he's been doing a couple of those, and I'm like,
his Buckminster Fuller book is really good.
Yeah, so maybe a Charlie Poole book down the line, or
Maybe so.
Yeah.
Or any of the nonfiction topics that fascinate me. But I'm increasingly interested in regional lore and regional legends and all the underpinnings, which often are political or racist or what have you. But I also got interested in creative nonfiction because I'm trying to write more directly about my own experience and my own perspective on things, without all these mediating characters, of course. And I'm finding how surprisingly difficult that is, and so I'm proud I had 2 essays come out
Nice.
last year on this order, one of which is now up for a push cart. And it was titled Role Playing at Poe, where my friend Amy Armiento got a bunch of people, fiction writers, tour guides, biographers, musicians, to talk about Poe's influence on them. And I write about this conference and things in there.
Oh, nice.
But the other one was in JFA, at Journal of the Fantastic and the Arts, and that was called Alexis Brooks DeVita Found Within the Essay the Perfect Title for the Essay, which is It Is Always Time to Talk About These Things.
Nice.
Where I try to delve into the racist history of my hometown, my home church, my family, and the things that I'm trying to, it's too glib to say atone for, but try to account for or counteract.
You don't want to take on
in my own fiction
more responsibility.
No, I can't. No, I can't claim some sort of. I don't want to pull that. Who was the sinners in the hands of an angry God? Who was that famous Puritan? But anyway. I don't want
Jonathan Edwards.
Yes, I don't want to do that Jonathan Edwards, I am the worst sinner that ever was thing, because a random glance through headlines will show we are not the worst sinners that ever were. On the other hand, there are levels of complicity, being complicit, and we all have to reckon with that eventually and think about it. And so this is my first attempt to write about that, and that's in the JFA, and they're talking about putting that outward facing on their website, so it's great. Like anybody can find it. So tough, hard to do, but worth doing. And I'm finding that it doesn't interrupt the fiction. It doesn't take away from the fiction. It helps feed the fiction.
I was asked to do a memoir piece for the Russ reissue. Feminist Press did a reissue of her mainstream novella, and I ended up writing about all the ways Russ influenced me, but also my own life and various things I'm struggling with as a parent, etc., so on, and gender terms and whatever. But it's honestly, I think, one of the most satisfying things I've written.
Yeah.
There's something about and you bring your creative writing skills, you bring your storytelling skills to nonfiction, but it lets you wrestle kind of explicitly with these issues, right? In a way that in a story you might be putting it in subtext, right?
Yes. I have heard various prominent, successful people talk about in athletics, in performance, in music, where you give absolutely everything you have, you put absolutely everything into something, and the level of satisfaction you get from that. And I think when we who are used to doing just fiction try to apply those techniques to our own stories or our own perspectives without the intervening fiction, it's both very difficult, but boy is it thrilling when you manage to get something down that you lived through, or that you perceived.
I don't know if you run across Dorothy Allison has this collection of essays called Skin, talking about sex, class, and literature, which I think is really great. And I know at one point she talks about how she thinks the best writing comes when you're terrified and you write through it anyway.
That's right?
And the audience can tell. The readers know that you are making yourself vulnerable and this is hard for you, and they respond to that, I think. So
Ashley Blooms, who is very good, was big Allison was a big influence on Ashley.
I love Allison. I'm not familiar with Ashley Bloom, so I will look into.
What was the title of Bloom's first novel? I'm blanking right now. But Allison wrote a blurb for it.
Where I Can't Follow and Every Bone of Prayer.
Every Bone of Prayer. That was the first one.
Yeah.
And the other is the second.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So
there we go. So creative nonfiction.
There we go. We keep on working.
Yeah.
What else can you do? That's the most important thing to, I guess, to any aspiring writers anywhere. Just yes, do that. It's what you should be doing. You should keep doing it.
Can I ask? I hope I haven't exhausted you. If I can ask you one more question,
sure.
Just to kind of wrap around to the mill children, and that you mentioned while we were talking that your father was self-educated, your mom was a big reader, and the class. I actually don't know anything about your class background, right? And
right, the middle of South Carolina, peach orchards. Pecan groves, not pecan, but pecan is how we put it. We had aunts and not aunts, although the black population of my hometown had aunts.
Nice.
but there was so little interaction in that segregated town then and now that I didn't know from that. Youngest by far, my older sister is 15 years older.
Oh, wow.
My brother, who died not long ago, was 20 years older than me. Parents, both blue collar, uneducated, white South Carolina families, extended families. Mother's father mainly retail, mercantile, general store sort of thing, though he was also for a time sheriff, got elected. My father's people were all farmers, cattle and hay.
So how did you end
and
up
so
a professor?
Forth. Well, there's that. Yes, God knows. Both my brother and sister went to college and did not finish, dropped out, but they both were brilliant and made whole careers themselves, basically self-taught.
Right.
My brother in telecommunications, my sister in computers and software, and I came along, and I was the stone reader, and was very good at all the writing assignments. And so therefore, when I was taking the SAT, there was a questionnaire which careers are you interested in, and I was just filling out. I was just looking at all the little ovals and eliminating a lot of stuff. But I saw journalism, and I thought, well, that sounds like something that would require writing skills. So I filled that in, started getting all those flyers, and wound up a journalism major as undergrad, and doing that for many years as my fallback. But I eventually just decided I was going to really seriously try both the fiction thing and the teaching thing, and therefore a graduate writing program would give me the chance to try both of those for a couple of years, and pay the tuition and the bills, if I got an assistantship. And so that led me to NC State and into the arms of John Kessel in this field, which I've never left since then. So, but that bachelor's degree I have was was the only one in the immediate family. Though I had a cousin who had gotten a PhD earlier, and another cousin who had gotten a master's. But I was certainly the first in my immediate family, and so then my going back to grad school 7 years after my bachelor's just seemed freakish. There were a
Well, that's
lot
what I
of
was wondering,
conversations
yeah.
about that. And in the process, I spent every nickel I had, you know, and just had to.
This is what I'm remembering when I was teaching at Roosevelt University in Chicago. 70% of our students were first in their family to go to college, and I had multiple students who told me that they had to argue with their parents to be allowed to go to college because the parents were like, "Why are you not working? Like, you should be earning money right now, right?"
Yeah.
So,
I have a lot of conversations with my first gen students.
Yeah.
But and it was in grad school that I started sending out the fiction. But even so, I went back to journalism after the MFA, and it was not until years later that this teaching job opened up, and I took it and stayed there and got tenure, and you know. And I always tell my students, you will have multiple careers, not just multiple jobs. You will have to have multiple careers. You will have to be flexible. You will have to figure out who you are and what you're good at, and use those skill sets to jump from thing to thing as needed.
Yeah, I've been using the word nimble. You know,
nimble, be flexible, be an adjustable wrench.
Yeah, that's right.
But the so yeah, I had class issues, and I still have class issues.
There's a great story. I don't know whether you ran across it. In the early days of Strange Horizons, we published Kate Bacchus's story, Miss Parker Down the Bung, which is an asteroid miner story about a lesbian asteroid miner whose partner or wife dies in the mine, and she has to fight with the corporation to be allowed to go bring the body back up, and like brings in her union and so on. So yeah, it's a great story, and it's short and it has a great voice.
Down the Bung.
Miss Parker Down the Bung, B-U-N-G.
B-U-N-G.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So and that's available for free online.
Right.
So, Andy, this was so great. I could listen to you talk all day, because I think that's part of the the whole voice thing and the storyteller thing, right?
Probably so. I had a server, a new person at one of our regular restaurants, came up and took our orders, Sydney and me, years ago, and Sydney gave her order, and she wrote it all down, all very normal. And so then I gave her my somewhat involved order, equally involved. And I looked up, and instead of writing it all down, the woman was just sort of rocking back and forth and holding her notebook to her breast. And she said, "I could listen to you talk all day." And Sydney readily said, "Be careful what you wish for." Which I thought was a good reply.
I think we'll let your wife have the last word there. So.
Because she'd been listening to me talk all day for many years.
Well, she's still married to you, so she must like it.
She stuck around. Thank you so much.
All
this was fun.
This is great.
Thank you for reading and for asking good questions, and for all you do with the foundation and your own students and so forth.
It's a great field. All right. Thanks.